Super. So good afternoon, everyone. Today we will be talking about exactly how to assess the retaining nutrients effectiveness of wetlands, of constructed wetlands as nature-based solutions in Sweden. I have to say that this research was also carried out with the collaboration of Sofia Wikström and Fernando Jaramillo. So as a brief introduction, I would like just to point out three key aspects. First one is to acknowledge the bad eutrophication status that Baltic Sea has. And the second one, which is very much related to it, is the close, fragile, and very important relationship between wetlands and agriculture. And lastly, nature-based solutions as cutting-edge initiatives to improve, facilitate, and accelerate the design and execution of conservation activities. Among other things, nature-based solutions intend to unify a set of criteria and indicators to carry out natural resources management. So nature-based solutions or wetlands as nature-based solutions have been used worldwide and successfully to treat polluted water from agriculture, as you can see in these pictures with reed bed systems. However, there are certain conditions that wetlands should meet in order to fully exploit their potential. For example, multiple wetlands within the landscape would serve as natural traps. Moreover, only if they are located in a strategic position, then the waterborne will pass through them, and then the nutrient retention would happen. So how do we know how effective they are? Well, there are physicochemical measurements as well as bacterial assessments and vegetation coverage to create data series and then predict the behavior of wetlands. How do we measure this at large scale? Well, perhaps some of you are familiar to this spatial tool, which was created by the water district authorities and basically attempt to support the wetlands construction regionally. However, it still, when it comes to the local scale, it still have like certain problems to define a precise location of the wetland. So therefore, beyond the vast amount of wetlands that have been constructed in Sweden, how can we assess their effectiveness? Has it changed over time? Are we exploiting them to the full potential, and how is this related to the environmental goals that failed to be achieved by now? So to answer these questions, we define as a general objective to assess the retaining nutrient effectiveness of constructed wetlands as nature-based solutions. And we split it up, these objectives, into two specific ones. First was to gather a regional and national stakeholders' perspective regarding these disabling factors at the administrative level that diminish constructed wetlands potential. And the second one was to create a feasible set of criteria that respond to these disabling factors and allow us and facilitate the optimal wetlands location. So to accomplish these objectives, first we carried out a set of semi-structured interviews. And by doing this, we would gather the stakeholders' perspective. So we interviewed 16 participants coming from different institutions across Sweden, and we asked them basically their perception of constructed wetlands as nature-based solutions, the implementation, main limitation, expectations, and challenges. We recorded, transcribed, and coded all these data into the software in vivo, and then through abductive reasoning, we use the background context, the nature-based solution standard, and the interviews to finally design some spatial criteria that will allow us to see the effectiveness, the potential of these wetlands. For these criteria, which are spatial, we focused on southern Sweden, assessing 451 wetlands within the counties that you can see on this map. So for it, we use the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute constructed wetlands database, the digital elevation model, and the current land cover. Here, I would like to highlight a very time-demanding part of the work in which we had to reallocate each wetland so they would match with the channels created by the digital elevation model, and then further spatial calculations could be done. So moving on to the results. First of all, in the interviews, we observed that regarding their perception of constructed wetlands as nature-based solutions, there is still work to do towards unifying and the design and execution of conservation alternatives, such as constructed wetlands under international guidelines. Secondly, regarding the implementation, we observed as well that there is no clear watershed-based approach. The data is quite insufficient, sometimes due to budget, and little participation have been seen during these processes. The main limitations are mostly related to the landowners' willingness to locate the wetlands in the best spots, given that they may be located in arable land that is important for them, and their interest in involving larger areas. Moreover, we identified as knowledge gaps, long-term effectiveness, hydromorphology, harvesting management methods, data for modeling, etc. And finally, regarding the expectations and challenges, participants mentioned that it is necessary to define a clear objective at the local scale and then incorporate this into plans, such as in terms of constructed wetlands, the number, size, and the precise location. So taking into account the participants' perspective, we decided to focus on hydromorphology and the optimal wetland location to create these criteria. So the first criteria we designed or we thought about was the wetland area. The second one is the watershed area of this wetland. Third one is the agriculture, the percentage of agriculture within the watershed. Fourth one is wetland productivity. This was calculated with the ratio of wetland area over agriculture in watershed. And in other words, this criterion intends to calculate like how many hectares of agriculture is each wetland covering per hectare. And finally, the amount of lakes within the watershed area. So here, for each wetland, we gather data on each criterion. And then within each criterion, we split it up into 4 groups using quartiles. So by doing this, we ensure that each group would have the same amount of wetlands and eventually be able to be ranked. So for example, for the wetland area criteria, all wetlands with an area lower than 0.9 would be considered as low, with a low potential, and would be given a score of 1. For those between 0.9 and 1.8 would be given a value of 2, and we will be considered as moderate, and so on for the rest of them, as well as the rest of the criteria. So in the end, the worst wetland would have a total score of 5, and the best one will have a total score of 20. So the main the output that message that we got from all these numbers basically was, for example, the largest watershed was corresponded to the biggest wetland. Also, that more than half of the wetlands yielded a agricultural coverage higher than 90%. Productivity was 0 because sometimes the watershed of the wetlands didn't cover any agricultural land. The most productive wetland was actually a small one with a large watershed area and with a coverage of agriculture of 92%. And finally, most wetlands presented less than 5 lakes within their watershed. These maps that you see here are basically a graphic tool for decision makers to recognize or see regional patterns. And this map is the overall potential for the whole wetlands, the whole amount of wetlands that we assessed. in which the main message we want to convey is that more than 50% of them yielded low or moderate potential. Regarding the spatial assessment, also we observed a significant difference in the first four criterion, being the county Skåne, the one with the best performance. Regarding the temporal assessment, we found only differences in the criteria of agriculture in watershed, which show a significant decrease over time. So moving on to the discussion, of course, we focus on each of these potential criteria. The first one is wetland area. So the wetland area, while we gave higher values to those to bigger wetlands, because the residence time of the water would be higher, there are still other conditions that should be met. For instance, say we have a big wetland, but this wetland is also deep. So this means that vegetation would only be located on the shorelines, diminishing the wetland's potential to decrease, to diminish eutrophication. When we looked up for data regarding depth, we found out that this is missing on many of the wetlands database, which of course makes it hard to assess then the potential. Moreover, it is important to remember that vegetation plays an important role, and then it's very important to adequately harvest it and dispose, so the cycle of the nutrients can be closed. Moving to the watershed area, this is also very much related to water residence time. In fact, some authors suggest the ratio wetland over watershed, and they suggest the value of 0.5% is a threshold to say whether a wetland is good at reducing nutrients or not. In a very rough calculation we did using the average of the wetlands we assessed, we got a value of 0.25. What does this mean? Well, basically that the wetland areas may not be big enough to handle or to hold the amount of water passing through them, and therefore it would limit certain processes such as sedimentation or plant uptake. For this calculation, it is important to have a precise value, reason why field verifications may be necessary. Regarding the productivity of the wetland, it can work as a reference value to select the best possible spots, as this process is done, of course, virtually, so we can see beforehand what is going to happen, and then choose a place where we expect a higher nutrient retention. Okay, thank you. So the last one is flakes within the watershed, and while I said that most of wetlands overlap few lakes, it is still important to construct wetlands in coastal areas, as they would serve as the last buffer before the water reaches the Baltic Sea. And in respect to inland agricultural areas, it is important to avoid overlapping with other lakes or even other wetlands, so their individual potential remains fully exploited. And finally, in a nutshell, we want to highlight that this kind of criteria is meant to be complemented with by engaging local experts, including a watershed-based approach, and also increasing monitoring. So in this way, support decision-making and fully exploiting wetlands. So to conclude, the main disabling factors or drivers of constructed wetlands are, first one is their optimal location, but there are other edges that we should take into account, such as burdensome bureaucracy or limited budgets. This criteria aims to assess the existing wetlands, but most importantly, to advise on the construction of new ones, so we ensure that they will actually work. As I said before, this criteria can be enhanced, like with more data or field verifications. And lastly, more than half of them as I said before, showed low or moderate retention potential, which may be potentially or is potentially related to the failure of achieving the environmental goals that I mentioned before. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take your questions.